heated battles between the press and the president as he deals with escalating tensions with Iran and launches his bid for a second term are well known to our next guest. Joining us now, Sean Spicer, the former White House press secretary, author of The Briefing, and now senior advisor to the America First PAC. And Sean, let's start with the aborted airstrikes.
Okay.
Some critics in the media saying the president backed down, he backed off, he failed to deliver on his tough talk against Iran. What do you make of that reaction?
I think it's a no-win situation, right? So either he's a hawk rushing to go to war, or he's a dove that doesn't get it. But I think the president was very clear, and he explained his rationale that it was measured, it wasn't proportional to shooting down an unmanned drone. And let's keep in mind, he hasn't taken anything off the table. Right? I mean, there is still the ability for him to retaliate in some ways proportionally. Yeah. Correct. But I think the president was very clear that the loss of civilian life was not proportional to striking down an unmanned drone. That being said, all of the options still remain on the table. At the end of the day, he's also explained very clearly that the ultimate goal is is to keep them from nuclearizing, which prevents a threat to the region and ideally to us entirely.
Right, and that is a very difficult, treacherous situation right now. But how does the president's stance against endless wars, especially in the Middle East, which he has pushed since the campaign, how does that play overall with the press?
Well, I think, to your point, I mean, he's been very clear about wanting to get out and draw down of Afghanistan, Iraq, and other places around the world. This is something that he was very clear on in the campaign. And when you look at this president, he's been very consistent with following through, whether it's pulling out of the Iran agreement, moving the Israel embassy to Jerusalem, or tax cuts, regulations, all of the things that he said he was going to do. So, I mean, this is consistent with what he said as a candidate in terms of not getting involved in additional overseas conflicts.
Right, but I think, as we talked about at the top of the show, that there is a lot of elements within the media and the foreign policy establishment that really is almost always favors military action. Let's move to the kickoff speech in Orlando. Within a couple minutes, he's attacking fake news. It was kind of a red meat speech. Are things now worse between Donald Trump and the media than when you were in the White House?
Probably the same. I don't think it's improved. I don't think it's devolved.
But now we hear a lot more of that was almost treasonous. We hear enemy of the American people a lot more often.
We heard a lot of that before, too.
Yeah, and certainly the coverage of the president.
I mean, again, I think it's probably proportionally gotten equally bad. So you've got the president ramping it up a little bit. I think the coverage of it and the personal vitriol attacks by a lot of these folks, the ability for them to show that they're not neutral has gotten even more exacerbated.
Okay, let me talk to you about the campaign and the polls in particular, because the president claimed the media were reporting on fake internal White House polls that showed him losing to Joe Biden in a lot of key states. The campaign later said those polls were real, but they were old and outdated. So they weren't phony, as the president claimed. But public polls obviously showing Biden leading nationally by about 10 points, then other Democrats by lesser amounts. The media geniuses say, well, how can Trump possibly win re-election by just firing up his base?
They're the same geniuses that didn't think he could win. Look, he won 306.
I guess I set you up for that.
No, you did, but I mean, it's true, because if you look at the New York Times and other outlets and pundits, they all had him losing and losing big. They talked about the fact that we couldn't win Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. We hadn't won since 1988. Right. He pulled out a victory in all three of them. Look, at the end of the day, you've got a great president with a message that resonates, but then you've also got an RNC and a campaign that are working together hand in glove and building on probably the most sophisticated data operation that exists. So the point that I think needs to get made more than anything else is polling serves a purpose. Yeah. It gives you an idea of the mood of the electorate, where things are headed, issues they're concerned about.
It's not great that it's not above 42%.
But here's the thing. When you have a state, one of those public polls, number one, they're using registered voters, which is ridiculous. Okay. Two, is that when it's showing Florida a 9-point up for Biden, that's ridiculous. Right. Florida, since 2000, Bush v. Gore, has been within a couple points, not just presidentially, but you look at the DeSantis race for governor, you look at the Scott race for the Senate, all within a couple points. The idea that Joe Biden has a 9-point lead when it's always tilted in Republicans' direction for the last few is insane.
That is ridiculous, and also it's ridiculously early. You were on MSNBC recently talking about the resignation of your former deputy, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, and Hallie Jackson, who's a news anchor and reporter, said, Sarah Sanders did not always tell the truth to reporters. Do you regret setting the precedent for dishonesty when you were at the podium? What was your reaction to that question?
Well, I think it's very rich that Hallie Jackson sits in a chair at MSNBC where you've got Brian Williams, Al Sharpton, Chris Matthews, Rachel Maddow, and talks about truth. I mean, if Hallie wants to talk about truth, she should look at her own network and look at the fact that they've had to suspend or question a lot of what her own colleagues have said.
Right.
So for her to sit there and take this elitist higher than mighty attitude is a bit ridiculous.
But you have also expressed regret for some of the things you've said as press secretary.
Right, and the point that I made during that interview, Howie, is I think as a Christian, I've always said that I make mistakes, I ask for forgiveness, whether it's personally or professionally. I've been very clear about that. As you note, I wrote a book called The Briefing. I'm clear in the book. I've talked to you about it.
Yes, you
I've
have.
talked to other reporters, and I said it to Hallie at the time. But the insistence on going further just shows you how, I mean, that they have an agenda. She is, you know, I get it. MSNBC has an audience. But the problem that NBC has is they continue to try to decouple themselves, say, we're NBC, we're not MSNBC. You see people like Hallie sit in one seat one day and then go on MSNBC the next day to continue to further the left-wing ideological agenda of MSNBC, and they cannot discern the difference anymore. So whether it's her or anyone else there, they cannot say that they're different.
Just briefly, in this past week, we've seen the president do an interview with Chuck Todd from Meet the Press, ABC and Stephanopoulos, Telemundo, CNBC, and Time Magazine, where he said, I'm sure this will be the 28th horrible story I have in Time Magazine. Is this a return to the 2016 strategy of talking to news organizations even that he believes are unfair to him?
Yeah, two things. One is I think he believes that, you know, he understands messaging better than anybody that I've ever seen in politics. So I think as the campaign ramps up, he wants to talk to more and more folks. He believes in that sort of old school legacy media, Time Magazine, NBC, ABC, the big networks. I think what was really telling to me, though, is that if you look at two of the hosts, George Stephanopoulos and Chuck Todd, right? So you have Fox being banned by the DNC, and here you have a president, and this was a subtle note that I don't know many picked up on, was that here he is sitting down with two former Democratic staffers. He's willing to go where so many other people...
Well, hold on. Chuck Todd is not in the same category as Stephanopoulos, who worked in the Clinton White House.
He was a Democratic staffer.
All right. Well, nevertheless,
but I mean, the point is, I think that it was an interesting tell that this president's willing to go anywhere to communicate his message and his accomplishments, whereas you have the DNC banning an outlet like Fox.
All right. Well, Sean Spicer also willing to go just about anywhere, and we're glad you're here. Thanks very much, Sean.